Most people think they'll lose money in the stock market because of something dramatic. A crash, a bubble bursting, a headline that arrives overnight. That's the story people prepare for. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Most investors don't lose money that way. They lose it quietly, slowly, repeatedly, through decisions that feel reasonable at the time. In fact, some of the biggest losses I've seen didn't come from panic. They came from comfort. People assume investing mistakes are obvious. Bad stock picks, buying at the top, selling at the bottom, so they spend their energy trying to avoid those moments, timing the market better, finding better information, waiting for clearer signals. But that belief misses the real danger, because most mistakes don't feel like mistakes when you're making them. They feel responsible, they feel careful, they feel rational. That's why they're so dangerous. In 2026, the biggest damage won't come from reckless behavior. It will come from reasonable decisions, made again and again under pressure. People believe mistakes are about intelligence. They think, if I'm informed enough, I'll be fine. But information has never been more available, and conviction has never been weaker. Everyone is informed. Very few are disciplined. The misunderstanding starts here. Most investing mistakes aren't caused by ignorance. They're caused by emotional comfort. Holding too much cash feels safe. Avoiding volatility feels smart. Waiting for clarity feels disciplined. None of those decisions look reckless, but over time they compound in the wrong direction. Small errors repeated for years don't stay small, they scale. A 1% drag on returns doesn't matter much in 1 year. Over 20 years, it changes everything. And as portfolios grow, habits become more expensive. What felt harmless at $10,000 becomes painful at $1 million. That's why this matters now. 2026 isn't a simple investing environment. Inflation pressure hasn't disappeared. It's persistent. Markets aren't calm, but they're not crashing either, and that's exhausting. Narrative fatigue sets in. Every year brings a new reason to hesitate. More data, more analysis, more opinions, and paradoxically less confidence. I've noticed a pattern. Some investors look disciplined on the surface. They don't trade much. They read the right books. They talk about long-term thinking. Yet over time, they underperform. Not because they're careless, but because they're quietly making the same comfortable decisions over and over, avoiding short-term discomfort at the expense of long-term results. That's why avoiding mistakes matters more than chasing opportunities. You don't need to find the next great investment to build wealth, but a few persistent mistakes can quietly prevent it. The danger isn't one bad year. It's 10 okay years that should have been better. Before talking about what to do or what to buy or where to invest, the real question is this: why do so many reasonable people keep making the same mistakes? Because once you understand why they happen, they become much easier to recognize and much harder to repeat. That's where we need to go next. Once you accept that most damage comes from reasonable decisions, the next question becomes unavoidable. Why do these mistakes keep happening? Not occasionally, but predictably. The answer isn't markets, it's structure. I've always found it useful to sort investing mistakes into 3 simple buckets: behavior, time, and allocation. Almost every costly error fits somewhere in there. Let's start with behavior. Behavioral mistakes are rarely dramatic. They don't feel emotional in the moment. They feel calm. The mistake of inactivity is a perfect example. Doing nothing feels safe. If you don't act, you can't be wrong, at least not visibly. But inactivity isn't neutral. It's a decision. And over time, that decision has consequences. Then there's overreaction, not panic selling, that's obvious. I'm talking about subtle overreaction, tweaking portfolios too often, responding to headlines, adjusting plans because narratives changed. It feels responsive, it feels informed, but constant adjustment interrupts compounding. Now consider capital allocation. This is where many intelligent people struggle. They focus on individual investments instead of the overall structure. Too much cash, too little exposure to productive assets. They believe they're managing risk, but they're really limiting long-term returns. Then there's opportunity cost. This one is invisible. Money can only do one thing at a time. If it's sitting idle, it's not compounding. If it's chasing yesterday's winner, it's not positioned for tomorrow. Opportunity cost doesn't show up on statements, but it compounds quietly. And finally, short-term thinking. Not day trading, long-term investors fall into this too. They judge decisions too quickly. They expect outcomes before time has done its work. When results don't arrive fast enough, confidence erodes. That's when plans break. All 5 mistakes are connected: inactivity, overreaction, poor allocation, ignoring opportunity cost. Short-term thinking, they reinforce each other. The math behind this is simple. Compounding works both ways. A small return advantage sustained over time creates enormous differences, but so does a small disadvantage. A 1 or 2% drag doesn't look dangerous in 1 year. Over 20 or 30 years, it changes outcomes completely. Now follow the cause and effect chain. Emotional comfort leads to delayed decisions. Delayed decisions reduce time in the market. Reduced time means weaker compounding. Weaker compounding creates pressure later, and pressure leads to forced risk-taking. That's the irony. People who avoid risk early often take more risk later, not because they want to, but because time is no longer on their side. When these mistakes are ignored, wealth doesn't collapse. It stagnates. Progress feels slow. Goals drift farther away, and stress increases even though choices were labeled safe. That's what confuses people. They did everything responsibly, and yet results disappoint. This is why process matters more than outcomes. Outcomes are delayed. They don't show up on your schedule, but habits show up immediately. If the process is flawed, time magnifies the damage. If the process is sound, time works for you. There's no emotional climax here because there doesn't need to be one. These mistakes don't explode. They erode quietly. And the real challenge isn't understanding them. It's recognizing how easily they slip into everyday investing behavior. Because in today's environment, these mistakes don't look reckless. They look normal. And that's what we need to examine next. This is where all of this stops being theoretical. Because in 2026, these mistakes don't show up as bad decisions. They show up as reasonable behavior inside real lives. Time is the first pressure point. Mistakes don't cost everyone the same. If you're in your 30s, a small mistake feels small. Holding extra cash for a year, waiting for more clarity, skipping investing because things feel uncertain. On the surface, nothing breaks. But time is doing something quietly. Those years were supposed to compound. And compounding doesn't ask for permission. It either happens or it doesn't. A missed year in your 30s isn't 1 year lost. It's 20 or 30 years of growth that never had a chance to exist. By the time retirement shows up, that small delay has turned into a permanent gap. If you're older, the pressure feels different. You don't have decades to recover. So mistakes feel heavier. But here's the uncomfortable part. Many of the most damaging mistakes happen earlier because they feel harmless. That's how time punishes quietly. Now layer modern pressure on top of that. Social media has changed investing. You're constantly shown what everyone else is doing. Someone is always winning. Someone is always early. Someone always seems smarter. That creates comparison, and comparison creates urgency. At the same time, crisis narratives never stop. Inflation, recession, geopolitics, market bubbles. There's always a reason to wait. And there's always a reason to act. So investors get stuck between two fears: fear of missing out and fear of losing money. Most people don't choose one. They alternate. They hold too much cash because loss feels scary. Then they chase recent winners because missing out feels worse. That back and forth is one of the most expensive behaviors in investing. Let's look at how the 5 mistakes actually appear in practice. Holding too much cash is usually framed as discipline. I'm just waiting for the right opportunity. But opportunity rarely arrives with certainty. Cash feels safe, but over time, inflation and opportunity costs do their work. Chasing recent winners comes next. After sitting out, watching markets move higher, pressure builds. So people buy what already went up. Not because the valuation makes sense, but because regret is uncomfortable. Avoiding volatility is another common one. People confuse movement with risk. They sell at the first sign of discomfort, then wait to feel confident again. Confidence rarely returns before prices are higher. Diversification gets misunderstood too. Owning many things feels safe, but if everything is reacting to the same fear, it isn't protection, it's just complexity. And finally, delaying decisions, waiting for clarity. This one sounds intelligent. I'll act when things make sense. But markets rarely make sense before opportunity passes. Now let me give you one simple scenario. Two investors in 2026. Same age, same income, same access to information. One builds a disciplined process. They invest consistently. They accept volatility. They focus on long-term cash flow and valuation. The other reacts. They hold cash waiting for clarity. They adjust frequently. They avoid discomfort. 5 years pass. The disciplined investor experienced uncertainty, but compounding worked quietly. The reactive investor felt safe most of the time, but progress stalled. Neither felt reckless, neither felt irresponsible. That's the point. These mistakes don't look like mistakes. They look careful. They look thoughtful. That's why intelligence isn't enough, because knowing better doesn't automatically lead to doing better. And once you see that, the solution becomes clearer. It isn't about being smarter. It's about being steadier. And that's where discipline enters the picture. By now, one thing should feel clear. The biggest threat to long-term wealth isn't missing the next great opportunity. It's repeating the same small mistakes year after year. I've seen this over and over again. People spend enormous energy trying to find higher returns, better stocks, better timing, better strategies. But the investors who quietly do the best aren't chasing more. They're avoiding less, avoiding the mistakes that slowly drain compounding, avoiding the behaviors that feel safe today but expensive tomorrow. That's why avoiding mistakes is often more powerful than chasing returns. A portfolio doesn't need brilliance to grow well. It needs stability. And stability doesn't come from markets. It comes from behavior. Emotional control is one of the greatest competitive advantages an investor can have. Not intelligence, not access to information, the ability to stay steady when uncertainty is uncomfortable. Anyone can be confident when markets are calm. Discipline shows up when nothing feels clear. That's where most investors struggle. They want certainty before acting. But investing doesn't reward certainty. It rewards patience and sound decision-making over long periods of time. Wealth is rarely built by one bold move. It's built through consistent capital allocation, putting money to work, keeping it working, letting compound interest do its job without interruption. That's why the 5 mistakes we've talked about aren't warnings meant to scare you. They're patterns. Patterns you can recognize, patterns you can avoid. Inactivity, overreaction, poor allocation, ignoring opportunity cost, short-term thinking. None of these mean you're careless. They mean you're human. The goal isn't perfection, it's awareness. Once you see these patterns clearly, they lose their power. Decision-making becomes simpler, not easier, but cleaner. You stop asking, is this the perfect time? And start asking, is this consistent with my process? Acting without perfect certainty is part of investing. Waiting until everything feels safe usually means waiting too long. The disciplined investor accepts this. They don't rush, but they don't freeze either. They stay invested during uncertainty. They stay patient during noise. They stay consistent when outcomes are delayed. That consistency is what most people underestimate because results don't show up immediately. Months pass, sometimes years, but habits compound long before returns do. That's why I always come back to this idea. You don't need to be smarter in 2026. You need to be steadier. If there's one thing worth doing now, it's not changing your entire strategy. It's reflecting. Look honestly at your own habits. Where do you delay decisions for comfort? Where do you react instead of follow a process? Where does fear of loss or fear of missing out quietly influence your choices? Those answers matter more than any prediction because markets will always be uncertain. Narratives will always change. But discipline is something you control. And over time, that control is what builds wealth. Not loudly, not quickly, but reliably. So as you think about investing in 2026, remember this. Most people won't lose money because they were reckless. They'll lose time because they were reasonable. Avoiding that trap isn't about fear. It's about clarity. And clarity combined with discipline is what carries investors forward when others stall. That's the warning. And more importantly, that's the opportunity.